Okay, back to discussing the history of sexuality from Foucault's perspective. Discourse. Who has done the speaking, how they have done it, in what context, in reaction to what and to whom, how they interpreted it, and so on. The word discourse takes up and emphasizes the wider context in which words are uttered. Power are all sorts of systems of influence and control that human beings exercise with one another. What we were talking about last time is the way in which power and discourse have a very interesting and very potent relationship. One of the things that becomes habitual to those who read in critical psychology, Michel Foucault, Jürgen Habermas, etc., is they are always interested in who is exercising power and why. And if they're also in a capitalist system, who is profiting from this? So during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, who is exercising control? Who is exercising power? Now, it sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense, but that's not the way they mean it. They don't mean that, there's a secret cabal of business and government who's getting together and conspiring against it. No. People aren't organized in that way, usually, if ever. Instead, because power is very motivating, how will various governments use the COVID-19 pandemic, or how did they use it, in order to increase the realm of power, their realm of control? How is it that various businesses use that same process to increase the reach of their power, the amount of control that they have? And how many people lost control during that? How many businesses failed? How many politicians or those in power in a particular form of power will lose their jobs? So likewise, when it comes to discourses around sex and sexuality, which sexualities are celebrated and who profits from that? Who gets power from that? Or who exercises power in that way? If certain sexualities are repressed, then who is getting power and in what way? This becomes a very interesting question. So if the cultural sexual ideal for some people is guilt-ridden missionary-style sex with the lights off, and then immediate repenting and praying to Jesus, who is profiting and who gets power from that particular discourse? Who gets to say that this is the way sex should happen, and how do they derive benefit from saying that? And so it's a very strange way of looking at history compared to what we're used to. As we talked about last time, we're mistaught that history is just these empirical events happened over time. What Foucault does is he says, no, that these events are motivated, these ideas are motivated. Who is talking? How are they talking? What context are they talking? And how is this an exercise of power? And how does it further power and diminish power all at the same time? And so it becomes a very interesting lens by which to view history, and in this case, sexual history. So by way of review, last time we began to talk about how it is that... Apologies, let me turn this off. So, I'll turn it down so it's not shaking the table. So, we talked about how it is that as the bourgeois class started burgeoning in Europe during the Renaissance, that they wanted to keep the power that they had, where they could tell a king, no, I'm not going to trade this word, or here's the price you need from the ore from my mines, or the cloth from my mills. Like, to have that kind of power means that you have to work really hard to keep it and maintain it. And you don't want to do anything that will threaten or cause you to lose that power. And so you don't want to waste time doing things like masturbating. You don't want to waste time by doing things that will decrease your focus on getting and accruing and maintaining resources. And so I touched last time on this cultural guilt we feel. I've been paying attention to the memes about the work from home memes. And it's really fun for me to see the ambivalence in these memes where there's this pressure to be on point and super productive at your computer 10 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, while at the same time an acknowledgement that that's not really what we're doing. A guy invented a table, for example, that is the work from home table, where it looks like a valid home workspace. But when you lift up the laptop, there's snack cups that where the water bottle is. You lift that up, and a beer pops up, and things like that. It goes to show this cultural ambivalence about working hard, but what's the point? And so, one of the things that can happen in our society, and it happens generationally, is people begin to lose faith in that work gives them power, that work gives them control, whether it's working to obey commandments of a religion, and then that will then give them power and control, happiness in their own lives, or if it's working at an employment site to make money and the power that brings. People are finding that the more and more they work, it doesn't necessarily bring them power, and so they're losing faith in that particular model. Now, what we have coming out of the Renaissance, according to Foucault, is this emphasis on productivity. For those of you in the history and systems class, or who will take history and systems, you'll find or have found that during the Renaissance there's a strong value on you are what you create, that what you bring into the world is really the mark of who you are as a person. And that value was replete, and you can actually see the archaeological evidence for that today. In a tour in Italy, for example, we were walking through a building that was being remodeled, and it was a Renaissance era building, and there were moldings, stone and wood moldings, that were immaculately and beautifully carved. And what blew my mind is the carvings went into the juncture of walls. So as one wall is coming this way and there's another wall coming this way, the artisans knew that this part of their work would be covered up by this other wall. But because of who they were and the character that they had as artisans, their productivity, even the parts that were covered and they knew would be covered were still immaculately carved. And so I brought this up to the archaeologists, and they said, yeah, we see that constantly in Renaissance architecture. Whereas in other eras, if that's going to be covered, it's going to look like crap underneath that paint, or it's going to look like crap behind that surface. You don't see that as much in the Renaissance, where things are just immaculately carved, even though no one will ever see it, because of the belief of the carver, the belief of the artisan in terms of creating this particular product. So imagine coming into a world where there's this emphasis on productivity, and babies are a form of productivity, right? Having sex, having a baby, that produces something. But if you're not sexually attracted to women, then what are you producing? And so therefore, that is one of the ways in which homosexual contact started to become frowned upon, is there's no offspring that comes out of it. There's no product that comes out of same-sex unions. And so therefore there was another discourse starts to form around those activities. As I mentioned last time, this is where we see sexual sins ascend in church discourse from a sin like lying, cheating, stealing, inappropriate sex, to getting a special privileged position over and above violence even. And so with sexual, it's like akin to murder is the way the discourse starts. Now, some of you have read the New Testament. There are intimations of that. Like St. Paul said some very clear things right along those particular lines. At the same time, though, there are a lot of contradictions to that particular position. A woman caught in adultery who's about to be stoned. The Jesus figure in this particular mythos says, he who's without sin may cast the first stone. And one way of interpreting that is he who is without this sin, the sin of adultery, may cast the first stone. It's often interpreted as he is without any sin at all, like, stealing a candy bar when you were 8. It's more convicted in certain biblical interpretations, that he who's without this sin. So you have a bunch of men who have committed adultery, who are getting ready to kill a woman who has committed adultery, and then Jesus convicts their conscience. And then, as she's thanking him, he says, neither do I condemn thee. Right? If this sin is akin to murder, that should be condemned. And so St. Paul later goes, it's the sin next to murder. But then look in the context of what St. Paul was saying. And that this particular context with these particular people, these adulterous acts are having this very deleterious effect on the saints in this particular part of early Christendom, right? So it is like there is murder going on. So some of you are saying, yay, so Matt's championing adultery and masturbation in this unit. That's not my intent. What my intent is is to show that these ideas and these cultural practices have history, and those are motivated by certain phenomena going on at a given time, and therefore, who is profiting, who gets power? Well, the answer is the bourgeois gets power by staying very productive. And the more productive we are, the more power we're neurotically programmed to believe that we will have. Hard work, unfortunately, doesn't always pay off, but try telling that to an American. And so, with this, we have a strong tendency towards only do that which is productive. So we see churches really starting to emphasize the forbidden sin of sexuality come up. Male masturbation, for example, it used to be called onanism, after Onan of the Old Testament, where Onan's brother dies, and in the law of Moses at that time, if your brother dies and he is married, then you are now taking up that wife as wife, and you live with her as wife and take care of her children. And Onan didn't want to marry his sister-in-law. And God said, and according to this particular mythos, you got to marry her, you got to marry her. And Onan refused, and rather than marrying her, and of course sexual activity was an important part of marriage because it created babies, he instead masturbates and spills his seed on the ground. Like he'd rather jerk off and get rid of his semen that way as a big finger to God rather than marry. And so it's really neat. The way that story was taken up before the Renaissance is don't flip God off. When God comes and tells you directly, hey, you got to do this, and if you flip him off and jerk off and get rid of the ability to do the thing God's doing, he's going to smite you. And sure enough, God smites Onan and he dies, according to this mythos. But it's neat how that interpretation changes during this particular time of, masturbation is a waste of time. And so instead it becomes Onan was struck down for masturbating. And so therefore the sin of onanism is now created at that point. Not when Onan actually jerked off. No, that sin was disobeying God. Later it's turned into an issue of masturbation. And so what's really fun is when you look at the anti-masturbation scriptures, the discourse of when and what context those scriptures originated, it didn't mean how later they were taken up. And it's really neat because they're still interpreted that way in many Christian churches today. Like, I don't advise you going into your bishop's office and masturbating, but if you talk to your Christian bishop, priest, etc., about your masturbation, they are all going to take it up as a problem. And in some churches, they're going to take it up as a bigger problem than in others. So don't get me wrong, sexual improprieties in Christendom are frowned upon. That is a given. But this special attention. Okay, you masturbated last week. You can't go on an evangelical mission where you sacrifice time and money for 2 years. You're not worthy to give up 2 years of your life and thousands upon thousands of dollars of your money because you touched your clitoris or touched your weenie, right? That it takes that special extra sinemic sinness, and that's a creation of these discourses during the Renaissance that all get back to productivity. You wasted time by jerking off, and now it's sexually impure, and that's a way to control the discourse so the middle class can retain their power in the face of the king. I just love this. And so, likewise, I think I challenged you guys last time. Pick up the standard works of Christendom, the New and Old Testament for most Christian churches, or if you're a Latter-day Saint, the New and Old Testament, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. Mormons love their standard works. And find me any reference to female masturbation, right? There aren't any. Now, again, it falls under the blanket category of sexual impropriety, but it gets this special sinemic sinness in the Renaissance that's still with us today. Male masturbation, female masturbation. Although same-sex couplings are explicitly mentioned in the New and Old Testament, and there are some real violence that unfolded there. Women's same-sex is very rarely, if never, mentioned, and when on those rare occasions it's mentioned, there's still controversy around is that what the biblical thinkers were actually, or biblical writers were actually talking about. So, now, just because it's not forbidden doesn't mean it's that anybody's arguing that it should be allowed or should be promulgated. At the same time, though, the point we're making is that sexuality takes on its very sinful, very shameful flavor extra flavor during this particular time that still persists with us today. Now, another issue about productivity is where does our product go? Okay? If I'm being very productive and I am then wasting that which I produce, then in effect I have produced nothing. Or maybe my spending exceeds my generation of income. So if I'm generating this much money, but I'm spending this much money, then that is now seen as a morally bad thing. Not just foolish financially, but morally bad. And Foucault traces the history of that as well. That he noted that bastard children, meaning children that were born out of wedlock, were much more commonly occurring amongst the landed nobility, meaning those that were born into a royal caste, right? And having bastards is very expensive because every bastard that I have, I'm obligated to feed and clothe and shelter. So let's say I'm a duke, I'm married, I have 3 legitimate children and 24 bastards. That could really drain the family finances really hard because I've got all the upkeep for all of these babies going on, and that's really going to drain me. So let's say a conflict comes up where the king comes to me and says, I need you to field 10,000 troops because we've got a war coming up, and I'm broke because of all these bastards I'm paying for. I don't have the resources by which to arm these men, get them provision, get them supplies. I don't have any money, so therefore who do I go to? The new and upcoming merchant class, and I have to borrow money from them in order to field the army the king is demanding that I field. Oh boy. And so the merchant class sees this and goes, look at all the money they're wasting on bastards. Okay, extramarital sex, always a bad idea, and now it is an extra super mega awesome sinny McSin. Like, it is absolutely strictly forbidden. Anything that would potentially create offspring out of wedlock is going to be super expensive. And although we don't use that discourse today in that same way, we totally use that discourse today in the same way. In fact, it's an artifact of history that we still do this. So a cousin of mine has one of those, black tinted windows across the back of his pickup, and he's got one of those long white decal stickers that says, I hope you worked overtime today. Millions of welfare moms are dependent on your taxes, right? Downing these welfare because they're just lazy, they're not working, they're just eating up all of my resources. That in this society, I have to pay for other people's bastard children. Oh, it's still with us, right? If those women had just kept their legs shut. Because I actually talked to this cousin about what it meant, and he's using this very Renaissance-esque discourse straight out of Foucault, that if these women had just kept their legs shut, then it saved taxpayers billions of dollars. It's the same mindset that they're wasting power, they're wasting resources, and not only that though, now I have to pay for their bastard children and how unfair it is for me. Now, some of you have heard me tell this story before, and you know the second half, and that's where I asked my cousin, I said, okay, how much because he works, remodels restaurants for a living, and he works for a contractor, and he makes a good living for himself. And I said, okay, so how much does this and this job bid for that you're doing right now? And he told me, and it was these exorbitantly huge numbers. And I said, okay, and how much do you make an hour? And he told me. And I said, and you're the highest paid guy on the crew, right? And so I just pulled out my little calculator and did some math. And I said, this is how much money was taken out on taxes. And it was a few $1,000s. And I said, and this is how much your boss profited on your labors. And it was tens of thousands of dollars. Right? And I said, and you're downing welfare moms? It made no sense to my cousin. It was like I was speaking Greek. Right? He is so locked into the social imaginary, that cultural assumption about productivity and sexuality and productivity, sexual behavior and productivity, that he couldn't see that where his money is actually going is straight up the funnel to the fraction of a percent who make crap tons of money at the expense of everybody else beneath them in this economic pyramid we call capitalism. And so it was really neat just to watch his brain turn off. Because he's a very intelligent man, but just don't. Welfare moms, and I'm having to pay for their kids. Stuck record. Like, he is so embedded in that social imaginary. And then, so I tried again, and then he uses that, well, my boss works really hard, Therefore, he's entitled to the amount of money he makes. Okay? How many hours a week does your boss work? Well, he works 40. And I'm like, really? How many hours do you work? Well, 60. How much money do you make? Welfare moms and keeping their legs closed, taxes and welfare, right? He has this mental seizure because he works more hours than his boss, but by his reasoning, his boss is entitled to crap tons more money because his boss works so much harder, but his boss doesn't work so much harder. So okay? And so our social imaginary is so strong that we overlook the ways in which it radically attempts to, these discourses attempt to profit from our social imaginary, from our confusion. And don't get me wrong, the people with certain kinds of power, like the very wealthy who have a particular form of economic power, they are just as subject and just as much a victim of this particular social imaginary as the poor people that they profit from. And so nobody's looking at the discourse, and that's what Foucault challenges us to do. And so in the case of sexuality, he says, okay, the more I forbid libido, I'm not making it go away. I can tell people not to have sex. They still have libidos. So therefore, what's going to happen? And now the church's position at the time, back in the Renaissance, was just don't, right? Well, how has that worked out for us societally? How did it work out then? It didn't. How's it working out now? It's not. That no amount of social control makes libido go away, therefore you still see sexual behavior. And he highlights extramarital sexual behavior. The more I oppress something, right? Oppression doesn't liberate, it condemns. And so if I have a libido and I'm oppressing the libido, it doesn't free me up from my libido. Instead, it condemns me for having one. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was raised quasi-religious, like they'd go to a church every now and again, but one of the things that was very much a part of her family system, she's American, so no wonder, is sexual shame. She was ashamed of the fact that she had a high sex drive. And so she converted to a religion that has very strong messaging around sexuality and sexual behavior, and converted wholeheartedly, prayed to that God, fasted and prayed to that God, went to all the church services for like 5 years. And she came to me broken down in tears because the more and more she is fighting her libido, she feels cursed by God because her libido is only getting stronger. Not to imply that it's like neurotic. There used to be a construct in psychotherapy called nymphomania. It's nothing like that. Instead, it seems to be a very healthy, higher than average sex drive. And she's very carefully not exercising it with other people. And her life, her quality of life, she says, I thought if I converted to God, he would take all of these feelings away. And they're not. If anything, they're getting worse. And so there's a massive amount of tension. The more she feels like she should be oppressing her libido, the more active her libido is becoming. So this tension is something that Foucault talks about a lot. To relieve tension, there must be a space to speak to the unspeakable sex that someone has had. And this to speak to the unspeakable is called confession to Foucault. And so he doesn't just mean church. So if you guys have ever been to confession, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, you go in, the little cubicle or the confessional closet, and there's a one room, door here, a little barrier between. The sinner sits down with the priest or bishop, whatever, and the little door slides open. The priest, etc., invites the confession, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, and then the sinner recounts their sin. So as Foucault, and I don't have time, unfortunately, in these short videos to really get into some of the detailed history that he touches on, but I love the way he implicates my field in this, the field of psychotherapy. So he says that really confession involves three parts. You have the sexual act, whether that be prostitution or masturbation or extramarital affairs, then that's one part. Then you have the church, the moral enforcement arm, that then creates a lot of shame and guilt around the sexual activity. And then you have therapy that helps you alleviate the guilt for doing the thing that the church told you should never do. And so he sees therapy as a form of confessional. Of course, religion is a form of confessional, but like therapy is an anti-confessional in some sense, that the therapists are very much trained to help you liberate yourself from shame, the very shame that religion from his model caused. So therefore, it's confessing, but to a different end. Therapy looks a lot like a confessional. Of course, my clients don't come in and sit down with me and say, "Forgive me, Matt, for I have sinned." They don't do that. Instead, what they do is they tell me about all of the things they're doing that are unhealthy and are hurting them and other people. And because of the emphasis of my practice, a lot of time it's sex stuff. A lot of times it's affairs they're having, cheating on, all those things that would normally go to a confessional. So the other thing that Foucault highlights is the way in which metaphorical or so-called sinners confess to the prostitutes, that the prostitutes are also confessed to. I'm thinking of a couple friends of mine who are sex workers, and these particular women have regular clients, and when they have these regular clients, the relationship becomes less and less sexual and starts to look more and more like therapy, or even more and more like a maternal relationship, where, like, I can remember a friend of mine a couple of years was telling me that she was out on a $3,000 a night date, and usually those dates involve sexual activity. This man was a regular. He's a client of hers every other week, and they went to a very nice dinner, and then they went to a play or an opera, I can't remember which, but a formal activity. They go back to his place, and she's getting her tender under-nothings on to come in and do what she thought was negotiated service, and he's laying on the bed crying, and so she goes and holds him, and he cries about, he feels ambivalent about his marriage, he feels like a failure as a father to his kids, he feels like he's not living up to his potential at work, like this whole confessional, and she doesn't know what the hell to say, so she just, I'm sorry, honey, and just holds him against her tender bosom while stroking his hair, and he falls asleep in her arms. And like, she has to slowly, very carefully lay him down and tuck him in so she can get home that night. So we have another confessional there, that the war of shame and libido involve everybody who's involved in the various parts of that war. Those creating the shame, those involved in the feelings that create the shame on their end, the shame they believe they should feel, and all parties in between are all involved in this nexus of discourse that no one's really deconstructing or talking about the way Foucault did. Now, you get into the literature on, they don't necessarily call it confessional, but the way in which these feelings unfold and the people that it implicates and involves, it's out there now. Like, people are beginning to talk about it in a small way. But when I see, like, it's not, I thought it was a massage therapy place, but it turns out it's a massage parlor. In my very vulgar vocabulary, it's a rub and tug, meaning, yeah, your muscles get rubbed a little bit, but then they flagellate the client, right? Stroke the clients to orgasm, so rub and tug. And it was just over here, just over the border of these two towns. And what was neat is the discourse in the paper had nothing to do with, shame and confession and oppression of libido and how libido still finds a way. It's like that scene of the original Jurassic Park movie when the Jeff Goldblum character goes, life finds a way. You know what I mean? Well, for Foucault, libido finds a way. And there was no discourse of that in the newspaper or local news when that place was shut down and a bunch of people were arrested. So, as Foucault is deconstructing this, meaning taking our social imaginary and looking at where it comes from and what it means, that's what deconstruction means. We have this constructed thing we all take for granted. Oh, libido is bad, except in marriage, right? And then he deconstructs that, he pulls it apart. So prostitution allows for extramarital sexual feeling to be released safely, like a pressure valve to keep society operating. And so there's this incessant tension we see in the Western tradition between the legalization of prostitution and not. Now, Foucault points out that where prostitution is illegal, it still flourishes. I can remember I was as a college student in a town called American Fork, Utah, which is now blown up, and it's like an upper socioeconomic town. Back then, there were some people, upper middle class, who lived in American Fork, but it was largely a blue-collar town for people who worked for Geneva Steel or worked the local farms. And so I can remember that there were 3 women who had come in and were regulars. And I loved chatting with them. They're great people. And I had their preferences memorized in terms of what they wanted, the various kind of sodas and diet sodas that they wanted to drink. And, just charming, wonderful people. And a friend of mine came in, and he's a grizzled old veteran. And he goes, "Matt, why are you so friendly to those hookers? Are you trying to score some?" And I go, "Why are you calling those women hookers?" And, there's various discourses on where the term hooker comes from and where these women hook good men, like they put their fishnet stockings out and it hooks a good man who normally wouldn't sin. There's all of that discourse as to where he didn't know anything about that. It turned out that's not what he was referring to. Instead, he thought that because I was kind to them, I must be one of their customers. Well, 2 things. I did not know that they engaged in negotiable affection for profit. And number 2, doesn't matter. What I thought was really cool is how it blew my mind of, here we are in very conservative American Fork, Utah, that has the highest participating Latter-day Saint population in the world, and it turns out there was a whole bunch of prostitution going on. You know what I mean? The sex finds a way, libido finds a way. And so even where it's illegal, it still flourishes. Even where it's legal, it still flourishes. It's sex finds a way. So there was that big debate 2 years ago that certain Northern European countries were giving disabled people a budget by which to visit a prostitute or have a prostitute visit them, because it was seen as essential for the disabled person's health to have sexual contact. And uproar in the United States when Americans found out about it. And a very different discourse coming from Northern Europe, where they're like, it's healthy in terms of physical health. They're not worried about moral health. That's not even part of their discourse. They're worried about the physical health of their disabled people. And so it was really neat the way certain American audiences just lit on fire about how immoral and unethical that was. And yeah, the discourse is different here. Different people maintain power by doing that. So psychotherapy, again, allows people to confess their shame and guilt in a setting that removes moral constraint and liberates people from shame, while at the same time reinforcing the repression that helps keep people in line. Foucault calls out my entire field, man. It's really neat. He doesn't even bat an eye, just calls us all out. Look at the way in which you guys are both part of the solution, you think, and also part of the problem. You are now part of the yes-no discourse, the black and white thinking. So mentally healthy, for example, in Foucault's way of thinking, and I'm pretty sympathetic to this, is a cover for a productive member of the population that does not disrupt nor disturb society's function in a way that serves those in power. And I keep thinking about those people in our society who disrupt the structures of power that we have and that we maintain, and so many people will fight and die for. And when people disrupt those structures of power, it goes poorly for the disruptors. Some are saying, well, Matt, what do you mean? Did Martin Luther King Jr. live a long, healthy life and people were okay with him disrupting the power discourses around race? No, he was assassinated, he was killed. Think of the Stonewall riots, when gay men stood up against the oppression of the police. And there was violence that happened, physical violence, lives were lost, right? The structure does not tolerate those that disrupt the structure. And mentally healthy, you picture a mentally healthy person. Are these people who disrupt structures of power? No, they're not. They're mentally healthy is you are a good employee who, has good mental health about the tasks you're doing. And when you come home to your other, that you have a harmonious relationship with the other where you consume products and you do things that you pay money to do, and then you have children that are very expensive and you pay money. And so where's this money going? Right? It gets sucked up the funnel to the top fraction of a percent in this capitalist system. So yeah, we don't in therapy help people be guerrilla warfare artists, cultural guerrillas. We don't help them disrupt the status quo. We don't help them fight the good fight against structures of power. Instead, psychotherapy is a structure of power. Like in the addictions clinic where I work, we're not helping these people remain addicts. Instead, what we're doing is we're helping them get sober and get jobs and be good, productive American citizens, right? To stop disrupting the status quo with their homelessness and their need for Medicaid for their last emergency room visit. So Foucault clearly implicates the field of psychotherapy in this confessional process. At what point do we get to talk about consent, dog? You are a good puppy. But there are times when your begging for attention is not convenient. So let me give you another hug. Good loves and scratches. Now your brother wants some loves and scratches. Okay, so as I mentioned before, like the church wants us to morally conform, psychotherapy encourages us to morally conform as well, to morally conform to the societal standards. We even have a class called Abnormal Psychology. And what is abnormal? It is a comparative abnormal, meaning compared to the people in this given culture, these people do not fit close to the norm of that culture, and therefore it is psychotherapy's job to help them be normal. Well, what is normal in our culture? Those who are productive members of society. So he doubly implicates us. Not only are we involved in the shame, sex, confession dynamic, we are also, psychotherapy, he says, is misinterpreted as seen as like liberation from shame, unlike the church, which is very much the bringers and reinforcers of shame. He says at the same time, though, you're diagnosing people as mentally unhealthy, and the goal for both the church and for psychotherapy is to have a willing sheep in the cogs of society, that you guys believe yourselves to be at war with one another. Like, how many therapists are openly Christian? And the answer is, well, outside of Utah County, very, very few. And so, in fact, like a colleague of mine is a psychologist who happens to be a black man from the South, and he says that as an openly Christian man, he has received far more bigotry for his Christianity than he ever has for his race, and he suffered some pretty horrific racist things. So it gives you an idea of how the war between the church and psychology is, that if you're both a psychologist and religious, you're screwed. You know what I mean? So I was going to go on a long rant and tell some personal stories about how I made the mistake of getting a degree from Brigham Young University. Now, it was a fine degree. I got a solid education there. That's not the problem. It's that now it shows up on my Vita and on my transcripts. And in 5 occasions in my career, when I've been interviewing for jobs, it has come up in the interview. Oh, so you have a degree from BYU, huh? Are you Mormon? And when I point out, that's actually not a legal question to ask, the interview's over, I don't get the job 5 times in my career. So psychology believes itself to be in a war with religion, and religion may or may not believe itself to be in a war with the field of psychology and psychiatry. But regardless, their end product is the same, and that it's a good, constrained, productive member of society. So Foucault also calls this out and says the model of confessional, especially around sexual issues that we see in psychotherapy, mirrors the church confessional. So I do something I feel ashamed or guilty about. Let's say I'm working with a young lady and she masturbates several times a week. She feels ashamed and guilty about it. So she comes to an expert over moral matters. She goes to her bishop, right? And he is an expert over certain moral matters, and he puts her on a repentance plan. And she feels extremely depressed, and that decreases her functioning. So I now am an expert as a therapist in the moral matter of her life productivity. Because right now she's abnormal. She's different than the average person in her society. So therefore she does one form of confessing her sin to her bishop and confesses the same sin to me. And so the bishop is helping her work through a repentance program to not waste time masturbating anymore, to be righteous, productive. And then for me, it's to help her work through her depression so she can once again be productive. Wow. So to the church, you confess and you pay money. 10% of your income, tithing, right? In other churches, you leave money in the donation basket there by the door. For a therapist, you swipe your credit card for him on the way out. Wow. And then on the therapy side, it's also like prostitution. according to Foucault, that therapists have these very intimate relationships with clients, granted G-rated. He doesn't say therapists are boning their clients all the time, although unfortunately that does happen. No, what he's talking about is the intimacy and the paying for intimacy. Because as you know, as I've given an example, when women of the profession of negotiable affection have regulars, it often turns into what seems to be a therapeutic relationship or more of a familial relationship. Likewise, that same warm intimacy happens in psychotherapy as well. So I leave my confessional, I leave the church, I leave my 10 sessions of therapy or whatever it is, my 5 sessions of therapy, whatever my insurance company will pay for. And then a few weeks later, my libido comes up, I do it again, like this young lady after, I don't take insurance or anything, but let's pretend I did in this case, and let's pretend she only had 5 sessions of therapy. And she goes out and she masturbates again. Well, now she's back in the confessional and back in therapy. And so it's this ongoing cycle of repression and repentance, repression and repentance. So one of the things that Foucault also acknowledges is the way in which there are sexual revolutions that happen. And on the one hand, he says that nothing's really changed. And on the other hand, he says, well, some things kind of have changed. So the overall issue of repression hasn't changed. Well, what's repressed and how it's repressed has. So the revolution is people wanting to live a sexually freer life, not to have this important fundamental part of the human experience, or many humans' experiences, most humans' experiences, to be oppressed. And he says that the cycle of sexual revolution and oppression is problematic on both sides. The repressors and repressed buy into a problematic understanding of sexuality. So that it's a thing that can be oppressed or repressed, and can and should be oppressed and repressed, that by putting it up into second-dimensional thinking, it is always already misunderstanding what sexuality and sexual behavior is. He's arguing that it needs to be understood more from a third-dimensional frame. Now, granted, in our class, we would also be critics of Foucault and say, actually, maybe a fourth-dimensional frame might also enlighten us in some ways. So Foucault points out that for hundreds of years, there's been a tension in the discourse of sexuality, this kind of black and white thinking. One side does not own all the meanings of sexuality, and therefore the repressors and repressed exist on two sides of the same mirror that can only coexist with one another, and because without one the other would cease to be, neither can actually escape the mirror. It's one of the big disadvantages of black and white thinking, that if I think sex is bad, then that is already engaging me in a one-sided discourse with those who think sex is good. I've now collapsed this discourse into what is effectively the same thing. I can't escape it. And so if I'm, no, sexual revolution, let's embrace our sexuality, that has put me now in intimate codependent relation with those who are trying to oppress me. And so both of us are now trapped in the same discourse that is not helpful. We're now two sides of the same mirror, and nothing's really going to change. We'll keep doing sexual repression to revolution, repression to revolution, repression to revolution. It keeps happening. So, there haven't been that many, let me back up. There have been numerous sexual revolutions through the years. I can remember as a college student when I was first studying the topic of sexual revolutions, the sexual revolution that happened back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, and how it is that times then were very libertine compared to now, and how when the Great Depression hit, that some people on the other side said, yep, because we were so sexually licentious, God is punishing us with a Great Depression, and liberating, of course, from the discourse the power of those whose corruption actually created, their economic corruption actually created the Great Depression. No mention of that at all. Instead, this is God punishing us for our sexual sins, and so it's back to sexual repression again. Wow, and that cycle keeps happening. Likewise, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and then boom, Vietnam War. That's God punishing us for it. So that cycle keeps continuing. So language is very closely linked to power, and the relationship is codependent. Whoever determines what can be talked about and how it can be talked about determines also what can be known and how it can be known. Whoever determines what can be known effectively determines how we think and by exchange who we are. According to Foucault then, language is always political. Now, you'll see reflections of that kind of scattered throughout this class, especially if you remember our unit on identity politics. Now, Foucault didn't coin that term, but it is in that same branch of thinking as Foucault. Now, we don't take it up in a second or third dimensional way the way Foucault does, where it's black and white thinking, and he argues for radical relativism, a third dimensional way of thinking. We take it up more fourth dimensionally. And so that it's contextual, the ways in which language and fashion and gender and identity all situates me in social relations. But I'm a part of it and it's a part of me, right? We contextualize it rather than relativize it. So it is, I think it's helpful though and important for us to go, okay, how are language and politics linked? So I'd like you to think about your own experience, and it's going to be somewhat variant. Like if all of you were here and we were sitting around this big table together, about our sex education. And I would want us to unfold that sex education along multiple different discourses that happen simultaneously. What did you learn in your formal sex ed class in school? Now, if you're like most Americans, you didn't have a sex education class in school. You might have had a maturation program about here's how your hormones are going to change, here's how your reproductive organs are going to change, the end, and there's a lot of awkward giggling, and then people go out to recess. That's not actually sex education, okay? That's a maturation program. And in the state of Utah, for example, sex education doesn't happen in the schools. As a parent, as my kids started to get into junior high, I would start to get these very important documents sent home where I had to sign off. I had to read I was told to, I didn't, because all of this is stupid, but I was asked to read a form very carefully about the explicit, quote unquote, explicit material they're going to talk to my children about in school, and then I had to sign that it was okay for them to talk about this explicit material that actually isn't very explicit. It's very politicized, the language around this. The awkward giggling that kids are engaging in shows the power of this particular political discourse and the way in which they are being implicated in it. So who controls the messaging about sex education? And so there's the one that's formal from the school, right? The politics there. And that's formal, organized voting is going on, political parties are going on, kind of politics. But there's also the politics in the home where you were living growing up. What were the politics in that home? How was sex and sexuality languaged? And some would say, well, we are members of X or Y church, and therefore it is the language of that church that we use in the home. I'm sure you did, or I'm sure you all did. At the same time, though, as a therapist who lives in a particular community that is 88% members of a particular denomination, it's not the discourses of the organized religion most of them attend that is controlling the discourse in the home. They'll use the words from church, but in very idiosyncratic ways to control the sexual behavior of one another and their children in their home. That every person I meet from this denomination is as similar to and as different from as everybody else I meet from the same denomination. So there's the politics of the religion and who profits there and how, right? Well, if I'm confessing, I'm paying money, and that keeps the financial money coming into that particular organization. But also, how are people engaging in discourses of power around sexual messaging at home? And then likewise, I'd like to implicate media. G-rated media from, like the Disney Channel you watched growing up, to X-rated media in the form of pornography you watched growing up. Like, what was the sex education you got there? So what's the sex education you got at school? What's the sex education you got at home? What's the sex education you got at church? What's the sex education you got on mainstream media? What's the sex education you got from pornography? All of those are discourses that are political discourses. All of them are sharing certain messages around what is legitimate and illegitimate, and people are profiting from that in terms of gaining power. So, wow, I could rant about this for days. So we will actually cut it off here, and we will finish up our unit on the repressive hypothesis next time, I think. We might have an interruption. A colleague of mine is a researcher on kink, and I think she's going to visit with us next time. So on the YouTubes, we might change up the order of things after this class is over. So once we compile all the videos together for upcoming courses that might be put online, we'll put my conversation with her, and we may have two conversations about the psychology of kink. So we might do Foucault 1, 2, 3, and then kink 1, 2 But the way it's going to look for you guys this first time, so if you're watching this later, this won't hold true to you if you're watching it next year. But it'll look like Foucault 1, 2, kink 1, Foucault 1, and then kink 2. You know what I mean? Or Foucault 3 and then kink 2. So bear with me. It's a process.